7,000 years ago, someone walked out into the Arabian desert and stood a stone upright in the ground. That single act, one human being, one stone, one moment of reaching towards something greater, set off a chain of events that would eventually shape the religious lives of nearly 2 billion people on Earth today. And the question this video is going to ask, the question that the Quran itself demands we ask, is whether those 2 billion people are following God, or whether they are following a 7,000-year-old pagan tradition dressed up in the language of Revelation. Because what the ground beneath Mecca is telling us is something that the people in charge today have very strong financial reasons to never discuss. And something that the Quran, the book God himself described as complete, fully detailed, and neglecting nothing, handles in a way that should stop every sincere believer cold. Let's start with the ground. Because the earth of the Arabian Peninsula has been keeping a secret for 7 millennia, and archaeologists have only recently begun to uncover it in its full, staggering scale. Northwestern Saudi Arabia, 5,000 years before the Common Era. This is what geologists call the Holocene humid period, Green Arabia. The desert was not a desert. There were lakes, there were rivers cutting through valleys that are now bone dry. There were grasslands stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Nomadic cattle herders moved across this living landscape, following water, following grazing land, living and dying under an open sky. And across this landscape they were building something. Not houses, not walls for defense, not storage, something else entirely. Something that tells us with extraordinary clarity exactly what mattered most to these people. Massive rectangular stone enclosures, some of them stretching over 600 meters in length, longer than 6 football fields placed end to end. Built from unworked local stone, basalt and sandstone, stacked without mortar, with walls rarely more than a meter high. These structures could shelter no one from rain. They could protect no one from enemies. They served one purpose, and one purpose only: ritual. The Arabic word for rectangle is Mustatil, and these are the Mustatils of northwestern Saudi Arabia. Over 1,600 of them, documented across a 200,000 square kilometer area, roughly the size of the United Kingdom. One of the largest ritual landscapes ever identified anywhere on Earth. And almost no one outside of specialist archaeology knows they exist, which is itself a question worth sitting with. But let's first understand what they are, because the details matter enormously. Every single Mustatil follows the same architectural logic. Not approximately the same. The same. There is a base, an entrance platform, sometimes with narrow or partially blocked gates. This is a threshold, a boundary between the ordinary world and sacred space. You cross it deliberately. You leave something behind when you enter. Then there are long parallel walls creating an elongated open courtyard, a processional path. People don't stand at the entrance and worship. They walk through this space towards something at the far end. At the far end is the head, a larger, heavier platform, the destination, the culmination of the processional journey through the courtyard. And inside the head, at the very center, there is an upright stone. Natural, unworked, not shaped by human hands into an idol. Simply a stone stood upright, chosen and placed as the physical focal point of all ritual activity. The place where the community met the divine. Now hold that image for a moment. Entrance threshold, elongated rectangular courtyard, processional movement toward a sacred focal point, upright stone at the center. Hold it firmly in your mind. Around these sacred stones, archaeologists found what makes this entire picture suddenly feel overwhelming. Thousands of animal bones, cattle skulls, goat skulls, gazelle remains, carefully placed around and upon the sacred stone. Radiocarbon dated to between 5,300 and 5,000 BCE. These were not the remains of meals. They were sacrificial offerings. Ritual slaughter. Animals brought from considerable distances, not local animals, animals that had been transported and killed at the foot of the upright stone, in the open-air rectangular enclosure, during what were clearly seasonal communal gatherings. Communities traveling from far away to converge on these sacred rectangles, bringing their animals, performing their sacrifice, circling the sacred center. And the Mustatils were positioned in relation to water. Almost universally, these structures align toward water sources, wadis, seasonal riverbeds, ancient lake beds. The sacred rectangle and the water source are one system. For a cattle-herding people, this is essential. Cattle need water constantly. A gathering site drawing multiple communities and their herds must be near water. The ritual and the water are inseparable. Now, let's lay the second image directly next to the first. There is a rectangular structure. It sits in an open courtyard, roofless, open to the sky, just like the Mustatils. It has a sacred stone embedded in its corner, a stone that pilgrims travel from every corner of the earth to touch and venerate. Around this structure, pilgrims perform circumambulation. They walk circuits around it, moving around the sacred focal point. Animals are sacrificed as part of the pilgrimage ritual. Communities travel from every nation on earth, having saved for years or decades, to participate in a seasonal gathering. The structure sits adjacent to the only significant underground water source in the area, the Zamzam well, in a barren, bowl-shaped valley where water would otherwise be impossible to find. That structure is the Kaaba in Mecca. And now let's look at this comparison not as a vague similarity, but as a precise structural match, because the precision here is what matters. Mustatil, elongated rectangular enclosure. Kaaba, rectangular enclosure, and we will return to exactly how rectangular in a moment, because this detail is critical. Mustatil, open to the sky, no roof. Kaaba, open courtyard, no roof over the structure itself. Even the Kaaba at first didn't have a roof or just a temporary one made of wood or cloth. Mustatil, processional movement through an elongated space toward a sacred center. Kaaba, circumambulatory movement around a sacred center, movement that by definition keeps the sacred focal point at its heart. Mustatil, sacred stone at the center, the physical point where the human meets the divine. Kaaba, sacred stone embedded in the corner, the most venerated physical object in the entire complex. Mustatil, animal sacrifice as the central ritual act performed at the sacred stone. Kaaba, animal sacrifice as a central ritual act of the pilgrimage. Mustatil, seasonal communal gathering, communities traveling from great distances. Kaaba, annual pilgrimage, communities traveling from the entire world. Mustatil, aligned toward a water source as an inseparable part of the ritual system. Kaaba, situated directly adjacent to the Zamzam well, the only water source in an otherwise waterless valley. Every single feature. Not most of them. Every one. And this is before we even get to the architectural detail that makes the match even more precise. Because the Kaaba is not actually a cube. The word Kaaba means cube, yes, but the cubic shape is relatively recent in the structure's history. Right next to the northwest wall of the current Kaaba, there is a semicircular low wall called the Hatim, also referred to as the Hajar Ismail. Even within the Islamic historical tradition itself, this wall is said to mark the boundary of the original Kaaba's foundation. When the Quraysh rebuilt the structure around 605 CE, just years before the beginning of the prophetic mission, they left that section out. They ran out of funds they considered ritually acceptable to use in the construction. They shortened the structure, made it more square, more cubic. When you add the Hatim back into the footprint, when you restore the space that was always meant to be part of the structure, what you get is a building that is noticeably more elongated, more rectangular, closer in proportion to the ancient ritual rectangles that have been scattered across this peninsula for 7,000 years. The Kaaba, before the Quraysh's budget cut, was not a cube. It was a rectangle, a sacred rectangle, sitting in an open courtyard with a sacred stone at its most venerated point. Next to a water source, at a seasonal pilgrimage site where animals were sacrificed, the Mustatils are not a coincidence. They are the origin. And the people who built the Mustatils, and the people who came after them across the millennia of the Neolithic and Bronze Age and Iron Age Arabian Peninsula, left something else behind that makes the origin of the Meccan sanctuary even clearer. Because the Kaaba was not the only Kaaba. This is the part of the story that is almost never discussed. The word Kaaba was not a unique sacred title reserved exclusively for the structure in Mecca. It was a category, a type, a term describing rectangular or cubic stone shrines used as regional pilgrimage centers. And across pre-Islamic Arabia, there were multiple Kabas, each with its own sacred stone, each with its own pilgrimage circuit, each drawing communities from surrounding territories for seasonal ritual gatherings. According to the Kitab al-Asnam, the Book of Idols, written by the 8th century historian Ibn al-Kalbi, there were at least 4 other major Kabas vying for the souls and the silver of the Arab tribes. There was the Kaaba of Najran, a magnificent structure in the southern Hijaz owned by the Al-Harith tribe. It was so famous for its prestige that some traditions suggest it served as a hall for the poets, where the intellectual and spiritual life of the south was centered. To the north, on the banks of the Tigris, the tribe of Iyad maintained the Kaaba of Sindad, a celebrated edifice known as the Dul Kabat, or the possessor of Kabas. But the real challenge to Mecca's dominance lay in the color-coded stones of the south. We are taught to revere the black stone of Mecca as a unique heavenly relic, but in the ancient world it was just one of many. The Kaaba of Gaiman featured a sacred red stone, and the most dangerous rival of all, the Kaaba of Dul Khalasa, housed a brilliant white stone, likely made of quartz. This white stone sanctuary was known as the Southern or Yemeni Kaaba, while the Meccan sanctuary was relegated to being the Northern Kaaba, Al-Kaaba al-Shamiyah. They were mirror images, they were competitors. And the tribes of Qatham and Dawes didn't travel to Mecca for their salvation, they traveled to the white stone. The rituals were carbon copies of what we see today. Pilgrims at these rival sites performed tawaf, the circumambulation, often naked as a sign of ritual purity. They practiced bilomancy, the drawing of divinatory arrows to seek the will of the gods. They even had a class of women called the Sayyida, who wove the sacred cloths to drape over these stone shrines, just as the Kiswa is draped over the Kaaba today. This wasn't a new Islamic practice. It was the regional standard for how you interacted with a sacred stone. This created a massive problem for the emerging Meccan brand. You cannot have a monopoly on the sacred if there are competing outlets offering the same product. The transition from a landscape of many Kaabas to a landscape of one was not a peaceful theological debate. It was a hostile takeover. By the time the dust settled, the southern Kaaba was a ruin. The red stone of Gaiman was forgotten, and the monopoly was complete. The history books were then written by the victors to ensure that future generations would believe there had only ever been one Kaaba, one black stone, and one path. They didn't just win the war for the peninsula, they won the war for the memory of the people. They turned a common architectural template into a unique divine anomaly, ensuring that from that point forward, all roads and all revenue would lead to only one place. And this tradition had a practical dimension that explains its persistence across millennia with remarkable clarity. Because wherever these sacred enclosures existed, commerce followed. The seasonal pilgrimage gathering required a sacred truce, a period during which the normal tribal violence of the peninsula was suspended. During that truce, people who would otherwise be enemies could travel, meet, trade, exchange. The sacred rectangle was not just a spiritual center. It was an economic engine. The religion and the commerce were a single system. They always had been. From the Mustatils of 5000 BCE to the trading networks of pre-Islamic Arabia, the sacred gathering site and the trade fair were the same event. The Quraysh of Mecca understood this better than anyone who had come before them. What they did was not invent a new institution. They inherited an ancient template, and they optimized it. They centralized. They organized. They took the most strategically located version of this ancient system, the one with the best water supply, the one in the most central geographic position in the peninsula, and they made it the only one that mattered. They brought all the tribal deities inside their Kaaba. By housing multiple gods in one shrine, they guaranteed that multiple tribes had a reason to come, to observe the truce, to trade. They created a pan-Arabian economic peace through the language of pan-Arabian religion. And they did it so effectively and so completely that the world eventually forgot the other Kabas ever existed. Let's now look at the historical record of Mecca itself, because here the silence becomes deafening in a different register. Every major trading city of the ancient world left evidence in the archaeological and documentary record. Coins, inscriptions, ceramics, mentions in external texts. Markings on maps made by people who had no religious stake in whether the city was important or not. Petra in Jordan, thousands of inscriptions, abundant coins, extensive documentation in Roman and Byzantine and Greek sources, clearly marked on multiple ancient maps. Trading cities across southern Arabia, documented in Syriac, Ethiopian and Byzantine texts, with inscriptions and archaeological layers going back centuries. This is what a significant ancient city looks like in the record. Mecca? The first external mention of the city in any non-Islamic source appears in 741 CE, 100 years after the death of the Prophet. The city that the tradition calls the mother of all cities, the commercial hub of the entire Arabian Peninsula, a global center of trade connecting the Mediterranean world to the east, completely absent from any external record for a century after the emergence of the religion that made it the center of the world. No pre-Islamic coins have been found attributed to Mecca. The city's name does not appear in any pre-Islamic inscription anywhere in Arabia, despite the peninsula being covered in ancient inscriptions from multiple scripts and traditions. No evidence of significant imported trade goods from the 6th or 7th centuries has been documented from the site. And none of the contemporary Byzantine, Persian or Syriac writers who documented Arabian affairs in considerable detail mention Mecca as a significant center. This is not a gap. Gaps are explicable. This is a silence so complete and so consistent that it demands a question. And the question is not whether Mecca existed. The question is what kind of place it was, and whether its prominence in the tradition reflects historical reality or the interests of the people who wrote the tradition. Because the people who wrote the tradition, who composed the biographical literature about the Prophet, the detailed accounts of early Islamic history, the Hadith collections that codified the rituals, were writing under the patronage of political rulers who had very specific interests in particular versions of history being established and accepted. The early caliphates, many of them drawing their legitimacy from their connection to the Quraysh family that had always controlled the Meccan sanctuary, needed the Meccan sanctuary to be understood as uniquely, cosmically chosen by God from the beginning of human history. The historiographical tradition that established that understanding was produced in the courts and scholarly institutions of those same political powers, a century or more after the events it describes. So is it totally out of the realm of possibility to suggest that the shrewd businessmen and traders of Mecca saw a great financial opportunity with the advent of Islam to create a never-ending revenue stream by making their city the center of Islam? And as the Islamic Empire expanded, new cities like Basra, Kufa and Damascus were gaining more importance. The people of Mecca now more than ever needed something to solidify their city as the focus of all Muslims worldwide. So they adapted and inserted the ancient pagan tradition of pilgrimages to these rectangular stone structures, where people came from far and wide to offer animal sacrifices via books with alleged actions and saying of the Prophet. And there is something in the Quran itself that makes the geographical picture even more complicated. The Quran describes, in multiple places, the community and environment of the people it is addressing. In chapter 16, verse 11, God mentions olives, dates, grapes, and various fruits as the produce of the land he has provided. In chapter 80, verses 27 through 32, God references grain, grapes, vegetation, olives, palms, dense gardens, fruits, and pastures as the things he causes to grow from the earth. In chapter 95, verse 1, God swears by the fig and the olive. Olives, grapes, figs. These are crops of the Mediterranean north, of the Levantine highlands, of regions with rainfall and fertile soil. These are not the crops of the Hijaz Valley where Mecca sits. The climate and soil of the Meccan Valley make olive cultivation impossible. It always has been. These are not agricultural metaphors invented from nothing. The Quran describes an audience and an environment, and the environment the Quran describes does not match the Valley of Mecca. This is not a polemical claim. This is a geographical and botanical observation, and it adds another layer to the question of whether the story of Mecca, as the singular, eternally chosen, cosmically unique center of divine attention, a story constructed by men with political and commercial interests in that story being accepted, accurately reflects what the Quran itself is actually describing. Now let's bring the full picture together. Because what has been built over 7,000 years is not just an archaeological phenomenon, it is a system. And that system is still running today, more efficiently and more profitably than at any point in its long history. The transition from a widespread regional practice, a landscape of Mustatils, of multiple Kabas with multiple sacred stones, of seasonal pilgrimage circuits serving multiple tribal communities, to a single, centralized, monopolistic religious destination did not happen by divine decree that appears anywhere in the Quran. It happened through a process of political consolidation, commercial strategy, and the suppression of the alternatives. The Kaaba of Taif was destroyed. The Yemeni Kaaba was destroyed. The white stone, the red stone, the other beetles and their sanctuaries, eliminated, absorbed, written out of the religious memory of the communities that had venerated them for generations. Not because God commanded their destruction in any verse that can be cited, but because centralizing the sacred site was good for the people who controlled the central sacred site. That logic, control the site, control the religion, control the revenue, did not end with the Quraysh. It did not end with the early caliphates. It did not end with the historians who wrote the accounts that became the authorized version of early Islamic history. It is alive and fully operational today, in the most literal and measurable sense possible. It still brings in billions of dollars annually from the pilgrimage economy. The quota system that determines how many pilgrims from each country are permitted to attend is an annual diplomatic and financial negotiation between governments. Mandatory pilgrimage packages, required in most countries and managed by state-approved agencies, are priced at levels that in practice place the pilgrimage out of reach for the genuinely poor, even while the theological tradition insists that the pilgrimage is a duty upon all capable Muslims. The definition of capable has never been officially revised to account for the pricing structures built and maintained by the same government that controls access to the site. And then there is what Mecca has become physically. The famous clock tower complex, one of the tallest structures on Earth, looms directly over the Grand Mosque. It was built by demolishing Ottoman-era historical structures that stood in the way of the development plan. It contains a five-star hotel whose premium suites face the Kaaba. That view of the most sacred site in Islam is a commercial product priced at thousands of dollars per night during the pilgrimage season. The alleged house of Khadija, the Prophet's wife, in whose home the first revelation came, demolished. The alleged site where the Prophet was reportedly born, demolished. The alleged cemeteries where the companions of the Prophet are buried, systematically cleared on theological grounds by the same authorities who simultaneously built the clock tower luxury complex directly overlooking the Grand Mosque. The fortress of Hajj, an Ottoman-era historical structure of genuine heritage significance, demolished because it was inconvenient for the development plan. Luxury hotel brands encircle the mosque. There is a Rolex store within walking distance. You will find most of the famous Western fast food chains and luxury brands all have a presence. The pilgrimage infrastructure has been professionalized into a hospitality product, tiered by price point. The ihram, the white garments that are supposed to erase the markers of wealth and status, are worn by pilgrims who have been simultaneously sorted into economy, standard, premium, and deluxe packages based on how much they paid. The spiritual equality that the pilgrimage supposedly enacts is stage-managed inside a price structure that ensures the wealthy stand closer to the stone than the poor. And this machinery is fed, as it has been fed for centuries, by some of the most financially vulnerable people on Earth. Families in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, Senegal, Indonesia, saving for decades. Selling livestock, selling jewelry and property passed through generations, taking loans, years of income for a single journey to a specific valley in the Hijaz, to circle a rectangular stone structure, to touch a black stone that God never mentioned in the book. Because they believe, sincerely, deeply, with their whole hearts, that God commanded it. And the system around them treats that belief as a revenue stream, as it has for 7,000 years, because that is what the system was built to do. There is something else the Quran says that becomes extraordinarily pointed in the light of everything laid out here. In chapter 9, verse 31, God says that certain religious communities took their scholars and monks as lords beside God. In chapter 2, verse 170, God describes people who, when told to follow what God has revealed, say, "Rather, we follow what we found our forefathers doing." God responds, even if their forefathers understood nothing and were not guided. The Quran is extraordinarily alert to the mechanism by which inherited tradition becomes a substitute for divine guidance. It identifies this mechanism by name. It criticizes it explicitly. It warns against the elevation of scholarly authority and ancestral practice into the position that only revelation should occupy. And then the same Quran is used to authorize a pilgrimage whose specific details are not in the Quran, are instead in the books of those scholars, are a direct continuation of practices stretching back 7,000 years to a Neolithic ritual landscape, and generate billions of dollars annually for a state apparatus that controls access to the site. The very pattern the Quran warns against is being used to sustain this. That is not a coincidence. That is the system working exactly as it was designed to work. The scholars became lords. The inherited tradition became divine mandate. The questioner became the heretic. And the billions keep flowing. The tradition claims that the Kaaba is a uniquely divine institution, directly commanded by God, with specific rituals mandated from the beginning of human religious history, distinct from and superior to all pre-Islamic practice, its sacred stone of heavenly origin, its rites preserved by prophetic authority through the Hadith literature. The evidence shows that the Kaaba is architecturally, functionally, and ritually identical to a tradition of sacred rectangular enclosures with upright stones that covers the entire Arabian Peninsula and stretches back 7,000 years. That it was one of multiple Kaabas with multiple sacred stones serving multiple tribal communities across pre-Islamic Arabia. That its specific rituals were codified not in the Quran, but in texts written by fallible men centuries after the prophetic period. That the black stone it is most associated with is never mentioned in the Quran. That the city it sits in has no contemporaneous external documentation as a significant center for a century after the emergence of the religion that made it the center of the world. That its physical environment does not match the agricultural descriptions of the Quranic community, and that it generates enormous wealth for the political authority that controls access to it, exactly as it generated wealth for every political authority that controlled access to it for the preceding 7 millennia. It is not an argument against the existence of God, or the prophethood of Muhammad, or the truth of the Quran. It is an argument against the elevation of a 7,000-year-old merchant system, dressed in prophetic authority it cannot demonstrate, and mandated by hadith texts the tradition's own scholars spent centuries debating, into a religious obligation that extracts billions from the poorest believers on earth and feeds it to an apparatus that replaces the Quran's guidance with its own. The God of the Quran, the God who in chapter 6, verse 114, tells the prophet to say, "Is it other than God I should desire as a judge, while it is he who has revealed to you the book explained in detail?" That God does not leave his final, complete, fully detailed message dependent on the memory of narrators in chains stretching across 2 centuries of political turbulence, court intrigue, and theological conflict. That God does not mandate the single most physically demanding and financially costly act of worship in the religion, and then fail to explain it in the book he called the explanation of all things. What needs to be questioned is the machinery built on the scholarly establishment that declared its codification's divine mandate. The political authority that centralized the sacred site and eliminated the competition. The commercial apparatus that tiers proximity to God by price point. The theological tradition that equates questioning with heresy and packages the questions in the language of apostasy to protect its revenue stream. 7,000 years, 1 stone, 1 rectangle, 1 water source, 1 seasonal gathering, 1 sacred truce that made commerce possible. The template persisted because the template worked. It worked for the cattle herders. It worked for the tribal confederacies of the Bronze Age. It worked for the Quraysh. It worked for the early caliphates. It worked for the Ottoman administrators. It works today more efficiently than ever, with quota systems and mandatory packages and luxury hotels facing the Kaaba and a global pilgrimage economy generating billions annually from the sincere faith of people who believe they are obeying God. The Quran is not silent about this kind of system. It named it, it described it, it warned against it, and it gave every believer the tool to recognize it. A complete book, neglecting nothing, clarifying all things, in which God said everything that God needed to say. Read the book. Read it on its own terms, not through the interpretive framework constructed by the institutions that benefit from a particular reading. Ask what is actually in it. Ask what is not in it. Ask why what is not in it somehow became the centerpiece of the religion. Those are not the questions of someone who has left faith. Those are the questions of someone who takes the Quran seriously enough to read it as God described it. Complete, detailed, neglecting nothing, and to follow only what God actually put in it. The question is what today millions of Muslims spend their hard-earned money from the poorest corners of the earth to make a once-in-a-lifetime sacred pilgrimage ordered by God, or just an ancient pagan tradition, cleverly disguised as a source religious tourism income?